You don't have to forgive me, I'm still speaking in English.
Thank you.
So in my very first year of teaching, I taught at a school for Bukharian. Louder? It's a big room. Okay. I taught at a school for Bukharian children. And after Pesach, we came back from Pesach break. And I went around the room and I said, how was your Pesach? Tell me something interesting about your Seder. And so the first kid said, my Seder was great. I had a great vacation. My grandfather made me hold a sack of bricks and walk around the room like this. Okay, so I'm 20-something years old. I'm a new teacher. I'm a mandated reporter, which means in America you have to report any signs of abuse. So I make a little note in my notebook. Okay, and I go on to the next child. And the next child says, my vacation was fabulous. My Seder was the best ever. My cousin whacked me with a bunch of scallions. I make another little note, and I move on.
They do. She still does it. I run away. She still does it.
So the Sfardim know how to tell a story. So the whole Seder revolves around this act of storytelling. And storytelling is not a two-dimensional endeavor, right? It's an experience. And the way that these students experience it with their Bukharian and I guess Persian customs is to actually, enact certain aspects of the experience themselves, more than just, us stiff Ashkenazim sitting around the table hemming and hawing. But in any case, the point is storytelling is a very useful and interesting educational technique. And that's what I want to explore today. What is it about storytelling that makes the Seder so special? When we tell a story, we're not just simply telling something that happened. We are experiencing something, and we're creating a sense of ownership over the story. When you hear a story, you become part of the story. You identify with the characters. It's as if you're sitting in the setting yourself. I'm sure we can all think of childhood stories that we heard that we really fell a part of and wanted to know what happened next, right? That's storytelling. So I want to zoom in to a story within a story. And that is the Ma'aseh with all of those famous rabbis who are sitting in Bnei Brak. But before we get there, let's take a quick look at the context. Okay, so this Magi begins with the Manishtana and Avadim Hayinu, the first set of questions and answers. As we know, the Seder has many questions and answers. This is the first set, okay? Why is this night different? This night tonight, not just this night many years ago, right? Why is this night different? And we were slaves in Egypt and Hashem took us out. That is the answer. And after that, we have a paragraph that begins, Ilu lo hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu et avotenu miMitzrayim, harei anu ubanenu ubnei banenu mishubadim hayinu leparah b'Mitzrayim. Okay? Had Hashem not taken our forefathers out of Mitzrayim, we would still be there today. Okay? I am now part of the story. Why? Because it's my story. If my grandfathers hadn't been taken out of Egypt, I would still be there today. That relates to me. Okay? ואפילו כולנו חכמים, כולנו נבונים, כולנו זקנים, כולנו יודעים את התורה, מצווה עלינו לספר ביציאת מצרים, וכל המרבה לספר ביציאת מצרים, הרי זה משובח. And therefore, even if we are the smartest, the wisest, the most educated, the oldest people in the world, we still have an obligation to tell the story, because it is our story. Okay, so the next part of the Haggadah is this Ma'aseh that I want to focus on. Now, the reason it's important to look at the context is, well, it's always important to look at the context, but on a very superficial level, this story answers some practical questions for us. Okay, so let's go through it. Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. Shahayu Mesubim Bnei Brak. So these 5 rabbis were doing Haseba, as the Rav said. They were important people, and they were leaning in Bnei Brak, having their Seder. And they were telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim for the whole evening, until their student came and said, our rabbis, you've been talking all night, it is now time for Shacharit. So what do we learn from this story? Let me hand it over to the audience. What do we learn from the story?
He's in the shubach, he stayed all night long, so these great rabbis showed us the example of saying it all night long. How is it the shubach? We're going to stay as much
Good. So in journalistic parlance, that would be the when, right? Or the how, right? How, addressing how you're supposed to tell the story. Okay. What else do we learn from the story?
They didn't have any students
They didn't have any students
to tell it to.
to tell it. Okay, the students were not present. Interesting. Okay. What else? Who were these people? The wisest. Okay. We just read, even if you're really wise. So this proves even the wisest did it themselves. Okay. So we're learning some very practical things. But why is this told in a story form? Why is it a ma'aseh? We could just be told, right? I mean, we were told. Why do we need an example? So I want to explore two explanations of this story that add a little bit of depth to this experience. Okay. Number one is the historical approach. This is brought down by many different people. The Haggadah that I like to use is Rabbi Nachman Cohen, who brings it together all very nicely. And he takes a look at what was happening in the world during this period. Okay, so this was, from the presence of Rabbi Akiva in the story. This is in the Tikva of the Romans, very shortly after the destruction of the second Beit Hamikdash.
Already destroyed.
Sorry.
Beit Hamikdash was already destroyed.
Correct. Shortly after. Oh, sorry. Did I say before? I'm not after. I'm glad you're paying attention. Okay. All right. So, you can imagine that there was a lot of uncertainty going on at this time, right? What were some of the differences between the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash and the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash? With the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, there was nibuah, there were prophecies, right? Explaining, warning that it was going to happen, explaining how it was going to happen, and explaining what was going to happen after. There was also a time limit. They knew that it was a finite amount of time. But with the second Beit HaMikdash, there's very little communication, right? There is no time cap. We're still waiting and wondering, okay? And so in this time period, there was a lot of uncertainty. The Ramban points out something interesting about the two tochachot that are in the Torah. One in Bechukotai, in Vayikra, and the other in Kitavo, in Devarim. The one in Bechukotai ends with Divrei Nechama. Okay, consolation. Hashem is going to remember the Brit. He's going to take us out and going to bring us back, and all will be well again. And the second tochacha, the one in Kitavo, that tochacha ends on a very depressing note. You're going to be sold as slaves, and nobody will even want you. So the Ramban explains that those two tochachot represent the first and the second Beit HaMikdash. The first positive ending to the tochacha is the first Beit HaMikdash that has a happy ending. But the second tochacha doesn't quite have a happy ending. So you can imagine, in the aftermath of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, things felt very fearful and uncertain. So these 5 rabbis, what might they have been talking about? They may have been talking about big questions. What is the relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael now at this point? What is Galut? Is it permanent? What is Geulah? Will it ever happen to us? These are big questions that they were dealing with. They were talking about it through the lens of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but it was relevant to their lives on that night. That's one approach. The second approach is the political and national approach that Rabbi Sachs brings up in his Haggadah. This pretty one here. I think it exists in Hebrew too. Okay, so Rabbi Sachs actually rejects the historical approach. I'm curious, I wish we could find out why he rejects it. I think that they could be compatible, but that's another conversation for another time. But Rabbi Sachs focuses on the national political situation of the time. What was going on internally when these rabbis were having their seder in Bnei Brak? Now, there's a Tosefta that describes another seder that was likely going on at the very same time. And that was a seder with Rabban Gamliel in Lod, not in Bnei Brak, in Lod. And Rabban Gamliel was talking about the mitzvot and the halachot of Yetziat Mitzrayim at his own seder, Benifrad. And here we have Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and the other 4 rabbis sitting together in Bnei Brak. So that helps us date the timing of this story. It must have taken place, claims Rabbi Sachs, shortly after Rabban Gamliel II was deposed of his power as the Nasi, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah took his place. Now, why is this important? Well, it was a time of deep division among Am Yisrael. In the context of this national upheaval with the Romans, we have this divisiveness inside Am Yisrael as well. Now, amongst the 5 rabbis that were sitting in Bnei Brak, there was a machloket that was very deeply related to Seder night. 2 of these rabbis, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Eliezer, were on one side of the argument, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua were on the other side. Rabbi Akiva, okay, the question was, until when can you say Magid? Until what point in the night? Okay? Now, the pasuk tells us, right, help me out. Thank you. Ba'avor zeh. Okay, so, right, Chazal connect the Ba'avor zeh, that's when we point, right, to the Pesach. The Ba'avor zeh, we tell the story while we have the Korban Pesach on the table. So the storytelling, the Magid, is at the same time, or only during, while the Korban Pesach is on the table. Until when can we eat the Korban Pesach? Well, there's a machloket. Okay, Team Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Elazar say that it has to be finished by midnight. And Team Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua says, no, you have until the morning. Why is this relevant? Well, they're all having Seder together. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah has now been appointed the Nasi. He's in charge. He's actually listed, if you look at the list of rabbis, he's listed in the middle. That's how they sat around. That was their seating chart. He was like the guy in the middle. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva were on the outside. Next to him as his deputy and his host, and then the other 2 were on the outside. It's fascinating. Anyway, sorry?
Wasn't the Korban Pesach eaten on Yud Aleph, though?
No, was that the... It was shafted then.
בזמן שהפכו לבית, בזמן שבית המקדש היה, זה יד א', אבל נקרא ממנו להישרף, זה ערב פסח.
Yeah, but then they ate it. Because they ate the matzah and the maror and the korban pesach, but that was the... Okay, so how did they resolve this conflict? This had the potential to blow up, right? And it was really up to how these rabbis were going to handle this machloket. And there's a famous Gemara regarding shofar, okay? When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai moved the Sanhedrin to Yavne, there was a machloket as to whether or not the shofar could be blown on Rosh Hashanah that fell on Shabbat, because that was something that was only allowed to be done in the temple. But now that the temple was destroyed and Yavne Ki'ilu replaced it, at least temporarily, could the shofar be blown on Shabbat? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, they were all debating it, and he said, let's blow the shofar and then we'll discuss. And they all said, sure. So they blew the shofar, and then they said, let's discuss. And he said, what's there to talk about? Right? Pretty sneaky for a guy who came out of Jerusalem in a coffin. Anyways, so perhaps something similar happened here, right? There was a little bit of an underhanded coup, right? Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua kept the conversation about Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim so engaging, just like I'm engaging all of you now, you're not falling asleep, right? All night, that they did not notice that midnight had passed, and they ended up talking until the morning. And when you see the story begins ma'aseh, a ma'aseh also often has halachic implications. These 5 great rabbis did it this way, and therefore this has halachic validity. Okay, so the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, they weren't just talking about what happened then, but the story became relevant to their lives in that moment. So to conclude, I want to wrap up by going back to our original question. When we tell a story, it brings us into the story. So when we read the story on the Seder night, what are we thinking about? How is it relevant to us? We know how it was relevant to these rabbis, but how is it relevant to us? So if you take the historical approach, I can't imagine that there's a person in this room who is not grappling with the same big questions that they were dealing with then. What is Hashem's relationship with Am Yisrael now in our current situation? Right? These are heavy questions, and we have broad shoulders to stand on. That Yetziat Mitzrayim was only the beginning. And the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is ours to tell, even in our generation. And from the national political, I don't think I need to spell it out, but the idea of unifying ourselves and not always rushing to be right and quietly, doing what we think needs to be done, for the sake of unity and for the sake of peace in our nation, that's something that we very much can bring to our Seder tables as well. Thanks, man.
Good.